Thomas Woodrow Wilson was a Virginia-born scholar and idealist who became one of the most consequential and controversial presidents in American history. Born in Staunton, Virginia on December 28, 1856, Wilson came from a deeply religious Presbyterian family. His father, Joseph Ruggles Wilson, was a prominent minister and theologian. His mother, Jessie Janet Woodrow, was the daughter of a Presbyterian minister. The religious atmosphere of his upbringing would profoundly shape Wilson's worldview, giving him a sense of moral certainty and mission that would define his political career. Wilson's early years were marked by the trauma of the Civil War. Though only 4 years old when the war began, he retained vivid memories of the conflict. He remembered seeing Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederacy, being marched through the streets as a prisoner. He recalled wounded soldiers and the devastation of war. These early experiences left him with a deep aversion to violence and a commitment to finding peaceful solutions to international conflicts, though this commitment would be severely tested during his presidency. Wilson was a late bloomer academically. He struggled with reading as a child, possibly due to dyslexia, though this was not diagnosed at the time. He did not learn to read until he was 10 years old. However, once he mastered reading, he became an voracious student. He developed a particular interest in history, politics, and literature. His intellectual development was guided by his father, who tutored him rigorously and instilled in him high standards of scholarship and expression. In 1873, Wilson enrolled at Davidson College in North Carolina, but poor health forced him to withdraw after 1 year. He returned home to recover and continue his studies privately. In 1875, he entered the College of New Jersey, which would later be renamed Princeton University. At Princeton, Wilson flourished. He was an excellent student, particularly in history and political science. He was also active in debating societies, where he honed the oratorical skills that would serve him throughout his political career. Wilson graduated from Princeton in 1879 and decided to pursue a career in law, seeing it as a path to political influence. He enrolled at the University of Virginia Law School but once again was forced to withdraw due to health problems. He completed his legal studies at home and was admitted to the bar in 1882. He opened a law practice in Atlanta, Georgia, in partnership with a former classmate. However, Wilson quickly discovered that the practice of law did not suit him. He found the work tedious and uninspiring. He was more interested in the theory of government than in the mundane details of legal practice. After little more than a year, he abandoned his law career and decided to pursue graduate studies in history and political science. In 1883, Wilson enrolled at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, one of the few American universities at the time offering advanced graduate training in the German model. At Johns Hopkins, Wilson studied under some of the leading scholars in the emerging field of political science. He wrote his doctoral dissertation on congressional government, analyzing the committee system in Congress and arguing that it had created a fragmented and inefficient system of governance. The dissertation was published as a book in 1885 and established Wilson's reputation as a serious scholar. He received his doctorate from Johns Hopkins in 1886, one of the first PhDs in political science awarded by an American university. While at Johns Hopkins, Wilson met and courted Ellen Louise Axon, the daughter of a Presbyterian minister from Georgia. They were married in 1885. Ellen was an intelligent and cultured woman who shared Wilson's intellectual interests. She was also an accomplished artist. The marriage was by all accounts a happy one, and Ellen would be a devoted partner and advisor throughout Wilson's academic and early political career. They had 3 daughters together, Margaret, Jessie, and Eleanor. After completing his doctorate, Wilson began his academic career. He taught briefly at Bryn Mawr College and then at Wesleyan University in Connecticut. In 1890, he was offered a professorship at his alma mater, Princeton. Wilson eagerly accepted, returning to the institution where he had been so happy as an undergraduate. At Princeton, Wilson quickly established himself as one of the university's most popular and effective teachers. His lectures on history and politics were renowned for their eloquence and insight. Students packed his classes. He had a gift for making complex political ideas accessible and engaging. Wilson continued to publish scholarly works during his Princeton years. He wrote several books on American history and government, including a 5-volume history of the American people published between 1901 and 1902. His writings combined rigorous scholarship with literary grace. He believed that academic writing should be accessible to educated general readers, not just specialists. This commitment to clear, elegant prose would later serve him well in his political speeches and writings. In 1902, Wilson was elected president of Princeton University. At 45, he was relatively young for such a position, but his scholarly reputation and his vision for the university made him the obvious choice. As president, Wilson proved to be an energetic and ambitious reformer. He sought to transform Princeton from a comfortable finishing school for wealthy young men into a serious academic institution that could compete with the great universities of Europe. He raised academic standards, reformed the curriculum, and introduced the preceptorial system, which supplemented large lectures with small discussion groups led by junior faculty. These reforms were largely successful and enhanced Princeton's academic reputation. However, Wilson's presidency of Princeton was not without controversy. He proposed eliminating the eating clubs, exclusive social organizations that dominated undergraduate social life. Wilson believed these clubs were undemocratic and interfered with serious academic work. He wanted to replace them with residential colleges modeled on Oxford and Cambridge. This proposal provoked fierce opposition from alumni and wealthy donors who cherished the club system. Wilson fought tenaciously for his plan but was ultimately defeated. The battle left him frustrated and embittered. Wilson also clashed with the dean of the graduate school over the location and character of a proposed graduate college. Wilson wanted the graduate school integrated into the main campus, the dean wanted it separate. The dispute became increasingly personal and divisive. Wilson again found himself on the losing side when a wealthy benefactor left money specifically for the dean's vision. These defeats at Princeton taught Wilson about the realities of institutional politics and the resistance of entrenched interests to reform. They also revealed aspects of his character that would resurface in his political career: his idealism, his stubbornness, his tendency to frame disputes in moral terms, and his difficulty in compromising. By 1910, Wilson was frustrated with academic life and receptive to overtures from Democratic Party leaders in New Jersey. The state party was controlled by a conservative machine, but reform-minded Democrats saw Wilson as an ideal candidate for governor. He was respected, articulate, and untainted by association with the machine. Wilson was nominated for governor and ran on a progressive platform, promising to fight corruption and special interests. He campaigned energetically and won a decisive victory in November 1910. As governor of New Jersey, Wilson surprised many observers, including the party bosses who had backed him. Rather than serving as a figurehead for the machine, he pursued an aggressive reform agenda. He pushed through legislation establishing direct primaries, workers' compensation, regulation of public utilities, and corrupt practices laws. He worked effectively with progressive legislators from both parties. In just 2 years, he transformed New Jersey from one of the most corrupt states to one of the most progressive. His success attracted national attention and established him as a leading figure in the progressive movement. Wilson's achievements in New Jersey made him a serious contender for the Democratic presidential nomination in 1912. The Democratic Party had been out of power for 16 years, but the Republican Party was badly split between President William Howard Taft and former President Theodore Roosevelt. Democrats sensed an opportunity to recapture the White House. Wilson entered a crowded field of candidates seeking the nomination. At the Democratic Convention in Baltimore, Wilson was locked in a battle with Speaker of the House Champ Clark. After 46 ballots, Wilson finally secured the nomination with the support of William Jennings Bryan and other progressive Democrats. The 1912 presidential campaign was one of the most remarkable in American history. It featured four significant candidates: Wilson for the Democrats, Taft for the Republicans, Roosevelt for the Progressive Party, and Eugene Debs for the Socialists. The campaign was primarily a contest between Wilson and Roosevelt, both running on progressive platforms. Roosevelt's new nationalism called for strong federal regulation of corporations and an active federal government. Wilson's new freedom emphasized breaking up monopolies and restoring competition. Wilson argued that Roosevelt's program would create a paternalistic government that would stifle individual liberty and entrepreneurship. Wilson proved to be an effective campaigner. His speeches were thoughtful and eloquent, appealing to voters' idealism while addressing practical concerns. He spoke of restoring opportunity for ordinary Americans and breaking the power of special interests. With the Republican vote split between Taft and Roosevelt, Wilson won a decisive victory in the Electoral College, though he received only 42% of the popular vote. The Democrats also won control of both houses of Congress, giving Wilson the opportunity to implement his reform agenda. Wilson's first term as president was remarkably productive. He immediately established himself as a strong leader who would take an active role in the legislative process. Breaking with tradition, he personally addressed Congress, the first president to do so since John Adams. He held regular press conferences and used speeches to build public support for his policies. He worked closely with congressional leaders to shepherd legislation through Congress. His leadership style was that of a prime minister in a parliamentary system, which he had long admired. Wilson's first major legislative achievement was tariff reform. For decades, high protective tariffs had benefited large corporations while raising prices for consumers. Wilson pushed through the Underwood Tariff, which significantly reduced tariff rates. To replace the lost revenue, the legislation included a graduated income tax, made possible by the recently ratified 16th Amendment. This was a major victory for progressive reform and shifted the tax burden toward those most able to pay. Wilson's second major achievement was the creation of the Federal Reserve System. The nation had suffered repeated financial panics because it lacked a central bank to regulate the money supply and provide stability to the financial system. After months of complex negotiations among bankers, politicians, and reformers, Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act in December 1913. The act created a system of regional reserve banks overseen by a Federal Reserve Board appointed by the President. It was perhaps the most important piece of domestic legislation of Wilson's presidency and remains the foundation of American monetary policy. In 1914, Wilson pushed through additional reforms. The Clayton Antitrust Act strengthened federal power to break up monopolies and exempted labor unions from antitrust prosecution. The Federal Trade Commission was created to investigate unfair business practices. These measures fulfilled Wilson's campaign promise to restore competition and protect consumers and workers from corporate power. By the end of 1914, Wilson had compiled an impressive record of progressive reform that rivaled Theodore Roosevelt's achievements. However, Wilson's progressive credentials were severely compromised by his racial policies. Wilson was a Southerner who had absorbed the racial attitudes of his region and era. Shortly after taking office, he allowed members of his cabinet to segregate federal offices that had been integrated since Reconstruction. Black federal employees were separated from white employees, and many were demoted or dismissed. When a delegation of African American leaders, led by Monroe Trotter, protested these policies, Wilson dismissed their concerns and eventually ordered them out of his office. Wilson's racism was not merely a personal failing but a policy choice that reversed decades of progress and legitimized Jim Crow segregation at the federal level. Wilson's first term was also marked by interventions in Latin America that contradicted his stated commitment to self-determination and democracy. He sent troops to occupy Haiti and the Dominican Republic, where they would remain for years. He intervened repeatedly in Mexican affairs, even sending troops into Mexico in pursuit of Pancho Villa. These interventions were justified in terms of promoting democracy and stability, but they reflected the same paternalistic attitudes toward non-white peoples that characterized his domestic racial policies. In August 1914, Wilson's presidency was transformed by two events. First, Ellen Wilson died after a long illness. Wilson was devastated by the loss of his wife and partner of 29 years. He fell into a deep depression and for a time seemed unable to function. Second, war broke out in Europe. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo triggered a chain reaction of alliances and mobilizations that plunged the continent into the most destructive war in history. The Great War, as it was called, would dominate the remainder of Wilson's presidency and define his legacy. Wilson immediately declared American neutrality and urged Americans to be impartial in thought as well as deed. He believed that the United States should remain above the conflict and position itself to mediate a peace settlement. However, maintaining neutrality proved increasingly difficult. American trade with Britain and France grew enormously, while trade with Germany was cut off by the British naval blockade. American banks loaned billions of dollars to the Allies. The United States was neutral in name but increasingly tied to the Allied cause economically. The war at sea created repeated crises in German-American relations. Germany declared the waters around Britain a war zone and began sinking merchant ships without warning using submarines. In May 1915, a German submarine sank the British passenger liner Lusitania, killing nearly 1,200 people, including 128 Americans. Wilson sent strong diplomatic protests to Germany, demanding that it abandon unrestricted submarine warfare. His Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, resigned in protest, believing Wilson's policies would lead to war. Germany temporarily backed down, but tensions remained high. In December 1915, Wilson married Edith Bolingold, a widow he had met earlier that year. The marriage raised eyebrows because of its timing, less than 18 months after Ellen's death. However, Edith proved to be a devoted partner who would play a crucial role in Wilson's later presidency. She was intelligent and strong-willed, and Wilson came to rely on her judgment in both personal and political matters. Wilson ran for re-election in 1916 on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." He faced Republican Charles Evans Hughes in a close election. Wilson won a narrow victory, carrying California by fewer than 4,000 votes, which gave him the electoral votes needed to win. His re-election seemed to vindicate his neutrality policy, but events would soon overtake his hopes for peace. In early 1917, Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, calculating that it could starve Britain into submission before the United States could effectively enter the war. Wilson broke diplomatic relations with Germany but still hoped to avoid war. Then British intelligence intercepted the Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany proposed an alliance with Mexico against the United States. When this was made public, American opinion shifted decisively toward war. German submarines began sinking American ships. Wilson concluded that war was unavoidable. On April 2, 1917, Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war. His war message was one of the most eloquent presidential addresses in American history. He framed the war not as a defense of American interests but as a crusade for democracy and human rights. "The world must be made safe for democracy," he declared. Congress voted for war on April 6. Wilson had taken the United States into the greatest war in history, abandoning his hopes for neutrality and mediation. Wilson threw himself into the war effort with characteristic energy and determination. He created new agencies to mobilize the economy, regulate industry, and manage propaganda. The War Industries Board coordinated production. The Food Administration, led by Herbert Hoover, organized food conservation and distribution. The Committee on Public Information created massive propaganda campaigns to build support for the war. Civil liberties were severely curtailed. The Espionage Act and Sedition Act made it a crime to criticize the government or the war effort. Thousands were arrested and imprisoned for anti-war speech. The Wilson administration's suppression of dissent was one of the darkest chapters in American history. The United States mobilized 4 million men for military service. American troops, called doughboys, began arriving in France in large numbers in 1918. Their presence provided a crucial boost to Allied morale and manpower at a critical moment. By the fall of 1918, American forces were playing a major role in the fighting. The German army, exhausted and facing the prospect of unlimited American reinforcements, began to collapse. On November 11, 1918, Germany signed an armistice, ending the fighting. Even before the war ended, Wilson had begun planning for the peace. In January 1918, he delivered his 14-point address to Congress, outlining his vision for the post-war world. He called for open diplomacy, freedom of the seas, removal of economic barriers, reduction of armaments, and adjustment of colonial claims with consideration for the interests of colonial peoples. Most importantly, he called for the creation of a League of Nations, an international organization that would prevent future wars through collective security and arbitration of disputes. The 14 points became the basis for the armistice and established Wilson as the spokesman for a new international order. In December 1918, Wilson sailed for Europe to participate in the Paris Peace Conference. He was greeted as a hero. Millions of Europeans saw him as a savior who would create a just and lasting peace. However, the peace conference proved far more difficult than Wilson had anticipated. He faced the conflicting demands of Allied leaders who wanted to punish Germany and claim territorial gains. French Premier Georges Clemenceau wanted to cripple Germany permanently. British Prime Minister David Lloyd George sought to expand the British Empire. Italian leaders demanded territorial concessions. Wilson struggled to reconcile these demands with his idealistic principles. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, was a compromise that satisfied no one fully. Germany was forced to accept sole responsibility for the war, pay massive reparations, and surrender territory. The treaty created new nations in Eastern Europe based on the principle of self-determination, but these boundaries were drawn in ways that created future problems. Wilson secured the inclusion of the League of Nations covenant in the treaty, but he had to compromise on many of his other principles. He left Paris exhausted and disappointed but convinced that the League of Nations would eventually correct the treaty's flaws. Wilson returned home to face a difficult battle for Senate ratification of the treaty. Many senators, particularly Republicans, opposed the League of Nations. Some were isolationists who wanted no foreign entanglements. Others objected to specific provisions that might limit American sovereignty. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee and Wilson's political enemy, led the opposition. Lodge proposed reservations to the treaty that would have limited American obligations under the League Covenant. Wilson refused to accept any reservations, insisting on ratification of the treaty exactly as written. He believed that any changes would require renegotiating with all the other signatories and would destroy the treaty. He decided to take his case directly to the American people, embarking on an exhausting speaking tour across the country in September 1919. He delivered dozens of speeches, traveling thousands of miles by train, trying to build public support that would pressure senators to ratify the treaty. The tour was a disaster for Wilson's health. He was already exhausted from the Paris negotiations and the political battles at home. On September 25, after a speech in Pueblo, Colorado, Wilson collapsed. His doctor cancelled the remainder of the tour and rushed him back to Washington. On October 2, Wilson suffered a massive stroke that left him partially paralyzed on his left side. The stroke was kept secret from the public and even from most government officials. For the next 17 months, Wilson was largely incapacitated. He could not perform the duties of his office, but he refused to resign or allow Vice President Thomas Marshall to assume his responsibilities. Edith Wilson, along with Wilson's doctor, controlled access to the president and made many decisions in his name. The extent of Edith's role remains controversial, but it is clear that she exercised significant power during this period. The situation created a constitutional crisis, as the nation was effectively without a functioning president. From his sickbed, Wilson continued to insist on ratification of the treaty without reservations. He ordered Democratic senators to vote against the treaty with Lodge's reservations. In November 1919 and again in March 1920, the Senate voted on the treaty. Each time, it failed to achieve the two-thirds majority needed for ratification. Wilson's refusal to compromise had doomed his greatest achievement. The United States never joined the League of Nations, severely weakening the organization and Wilson's vision of collective security. Wilson served out the remainder of his term as an invalid. He made few public appearances and could conduct only limited government business. The Democratic Party suffered massive losses in the 1920 elections, with Republican Warren Harding winning the presidency in a landslide. Harding's campaign slogan, "Return to Normalcy," reflected the public's exhaustion with Wilson's idealistic crusades and the disappointment of the war and its aftermath. Wilson left office in March 1921 and retired to a house in Washington. He lived quietly, rarely appearing in public. He hoped to write a history of his administration but was too weak to complete it. He remained convinced that history would vindicate his vision for the League of Nations and international cooperation. On February 3, 1924, Woodrow Wilson died at his home. He was 67 years old. His funeral was attended by thousands, and he was buried in Washington National Cathedral, the only president interred in the nation's capital. Wilson's legacy remains deeply contested. His admirers point to his progressive domestic reforms and his vision of international cooperation based on democracy and self-determination. The Federal Reserve, the income tax, antitrust enforcement, and labor protections were significant achievements. His 14 points and the League of Nations, though imperfectly realized, established principles that would eventually be embodied in the United Nations and the modern international order. His idealism inspired generations of Americans to believe that foreign policy could be guided by moral principles rather than mere self-interest. However, Wilson's critics emphasize his failures and contradictions. His racism and the segregation of the federal government were moral catastrophes that betrayed his stated principles. His interventions in Latin America contradicted his rhetoric about self-determination. His suppression of civil liberties during the war violated fundamental American values. His stubbornness in refusing to compromise on the League of Nations destroyed his own creation. His idealism often blinded him to practical realities and led him to frame political disputes as moral crusades in which compromise became impossible. Modern historians recognize Wilson as a complex and contradictory figure. He was a brilliant scholar and eloquent spokesman for democracy who was also a racist and authoritarian. He was an idealist who inspired millions but whose idealism sometimes prevented him from achieving his goals. He transformed the presidency into a more active and powerful office but used that power in ways that sometimes threatened liberty. He sought to make the world safe for democracy but compromised democratic principles at home and abroad. Perhaps the most important aspect of Wilson's legacy is his vision of America's role in the world. Before Wilson, American foreign policy was largely focused on the Western Hemisphere and on avoiding European entanglements. Wilson argued that the United States had a responsibility to promote democracy and human rights globally and to participate in international organizations to maintain peace. This vision, though imperfectly realized in his time, became the foundation of American foreign policy in the 20th century. For better or worse, Wilson established the framework within which debates about America's global role would be conducted for the next 100 years. Woodrow Wilson was neither the secular saint his admirers once portrayed nor the hypocritical villain his critics sometimes depict. He was a deeply flawed man of genuine idealism who achieved significant reforms and articulated an inspiring vision of international cooperation, but whose racism, rigidity, and self-righteousness undermined his achievements and damaged his legacy. He represents both the promise and the limitations of progressive idealism in American politics.